And so in the interest of time, to make sure that we stay on schedule this afternoon, I'm actually going to get started when talking about Emma and helping you get to know the new Emma. I think many of you may be aware that the MSRB has gone through a process of updating the Emma website. I think many of you also indicated you were familiar with Emma. Given that we were created back in 2008 and we've been celebrating this year our 10th anniversary, and as part of that process, we wanted to actually it was time for a little bit of a refresh. And so we actually are undertaking multiple phases in terms of doing enhancements to Emma. And what I'm about to show you and for us to go through in the next 20 minutes or so are some of those enhancements that were initially developed that were more investor focused, but I think for most of you will see that these are enhancements that will actually be beneficial to all users of Emma and just to the market in general. We've made changes to the homepage that I think many of you may be familiar with, which is our map-based search. And also we've made sure that to support some of the navigational issues that we had actually gotten feedback from market participants to help locate information in a lot faster and faster process. Some of these enhancements were also developed and redesigned to support the securities detail page because we had actually gotten some feedback that there was need for enhancements to make sure that information was easier to find. And so now I want to actually just, I think we've gone through the slide earlier this morning, but in terms of who we are as the MSRB and our regulatory mandate, one of the things I did mention this morning is that we are not federally funded, but our fees are actually assessed from regulated securities dealers and municipal advisors. And as you can imagine, when we talk about Emma enhancements, that the process in doing technology in our current world is actually quite costly. But I want to jump into to make sure that you have an opportunity to talk a bit more about and see some of the enhancements. I know that there are a couple questions that came up as it relates to the MSRB's role, as it relates to disclosure in the municipal securities market. And I think it's really important to let me emphasize that in terms of our overall disclosure regime and the requirements that specifically are made as it relates to the information related to 15C212 and the continuing disclosure event requirements, that is the jurisdiction of the SEC. The MSRB does not have jurisdiction over 15C212. As you may note, it's SEC Rule 15C212, and it is at the SEC's behest that in terms of what's required for fulfilling the event disclosures and for what is required in terms of providing disclosure information, that is within their rulemaking jurisdiction and authority. That being said, the question had come up in terms of now that information is available on the Emma system, now that we have all rating agencies available, that the SEC had initially taken the position that the issue of compliance still remains an obligation of the issuer. And then although that there is a platform that makes this transparent, it is still the issuer's obligation to be able to provide that information or to do those submissions to the Emma system. This has been a conversation that has been ongoing. As I think many of you are aware that there are currently conversations regarding the amendments to 15C212. And so that is in the last series of conversations of what information would be submitted to Emma. And under the event requirements, that had been essentially the SEC's position as it relates to taking away or amending the requirements in terms of having to submit ratings information onto the Emma system. And that is sort of from the last bit of conversation related to that. That being said, I think it's important to recognize that the platform that the MSRB provides with Emma, it's free, it's centralized, it's public. Over the course of the next several years, we're going to continue to look at ways in which we can actually enhance the information that is available. As I mentioned earlier today, that we have hundreds of thousands of disclosure documents that are available on the Emma system, and that we have millions of securities data points. And so as you can imagine, trying to organize all of that information in a manner that is searchable, that is user-friendly, easy to navigate, is essentially more than a notion. On April 30th of this year, we actually released several enhancements. And as I mentioned, we are initially targeting the investor community, but recognizing that these were enhancements that we've been hearing from market participants for some time. So as I'll show you shortly, we've enhanced the look and feel of Emma. We've streamlined the home page. We've actually done some work on the state page, as well as on the issuer home page to make information more accessible and easier to find. The issuer details page, we've added some bells and some whistles, as well as to the securities details pages, so that when you are looking for a security and you are searching for information, that you can find it as quickly and as efficiently as possible as you're looking for and organizing information related to Emma. So now for a little bit of the great unveil, the new Emma. As I mentioned before, early in today, we've actually done a lot of enhancements on the Emma homepage. So when you go to Emma, you will now see this is what will greet you. And as I mentioned, you can find information in 3 different ways: to learn, to evaluate, and to monitor. And in finding that information, we have, as part of celebrating our 10th anniversary, we wanted to enhance the overall color scheme. We wanted to make the presentation so it was a lot more in a table format to support those that may have sight impairments, as I mentioned, or including color blindness. We also created the zoom feature. We all are staring at computer screens much too frequently, so we wanted to make sure that when you're looking for QSIPs or you're looking for information, that you'd be able to zoom in. One of the things I do want to share with you that's quite important, when you are on Emma, the best browsers to use to make sure that you have access to all the features is actually to use Chrome or to use Edge. So many of the features have not been customized or optimized for Foxfire. But if you're going on to Emma, I would encourage you to be sure that you use Chrome and Edge to do so. One of the things that we also wanted to do for people who may be new to Emma, to make sure that they're oriented as to who we are and what we do, is we added this new tagline to the page. It says, "The official source of municipal securities data and documents." So when you come to Emma, you know what there is to find. And so we've actually also at the bottom of the page provided a brief description that allows you to understand what Emma is and who we are as the MSRB. Also, as I mentioned, on the right-hand side, you can explore many of the new features, and that's including the Learn feature, which we now have actually put in our videos, that we have now put the videos related to Emma into this one location. Also from here, you can access the Education Center on MSRB, and then also we have a whole series of FAQs. So if you have questions about how to navigate or how to find particular information, you can now go to Learn to learn about what there is to learn. Also, we have Evaluate. So the Evaluate button actually here is a resource which is really a central point for entering Emma. Is another place to explore for information. With Evaluate, you could actually go in and you can see third-party yield curves and indices that are now being placed on Emma. And then also it gives you can look at our market statistics area, which will give you some general information in terms of trends and the direction of the marketplace. With the Emma market statistics area, we've actually also done some overhaul in terms of the amount of data and data analysis that's now available that you can find in the market statistics section, and not specifically so where the new issue volume is in the marketplace, as well as disclosure submission. So this is now a new location on the Emma website where you can actually get additional market statistics. We've also included the price discovery tool, which I shared a little bit about earlier today, for comparing prices, yields, ratings of similar securities. And you can actually use the price discovery tool if you know your 9-digit QSIP or have access to that, where you can actually learn more about sort of trade information of key characteristics related to a particular security. And so that's some information I wanted to be sure to share with you, some of the new features that we have developed. And then the monitor button. I had also mentioned this when I was talking about the creating a My Emma account. So here you can actually enter into and here's where you can actually set up a My Emma profile. And this will allow you to get personalized email alerts and to search for a particular trade activity that you want to be aware of. So we've actually designed the overall Emma homepage to be the central portal for you to actually be able to go into Emma. So, and actually, now I have animation. Okay. So one of the things I want to share with you now is the state page. But before going through actually what's available here on the state page, I want to also make you aware of that there are 3 ways that you can actually search on Emma. First is using the issuer homepage. The second is quick search. And then the third is actually advanced search. And as you see on many of the pages here on Emma, you can at any point in time be able to go back to those search features that are available. But now let's explore the state page a little bit. And one of the highlights that I do definitely want to share in terms of the state page, we created this whole new look and feel. And as you'll see that we have these 2 new green action boxes. And these action boxes that are here on the right side of the page on the screen, it allows you to be able to go directly to the new issue calendar. So you can actually see what's coming to market, what are the upcoming issues, and you'll also be able to see what have been some of the recently sold issues. Oops. And so these are the 2 critical boxes to, when you come to the state page, to know where you can actually find information. Also on the state page, which you access through going to the issuer homepage, you can also, as I mentioned earlier, can see what actually entities have been customized. And that would actually allow you to get a better sense of, you know, what's provided for in the blue box in terms of when you look at a particular issuer, you can actually see whether or not they've been customized or not, and that information is now available in the blue box. In addition to where I just clicked onto, we have a whole set of additional resources that if you want to understand more about a particular issuer that you've drilled down into for the state level, this is actually a new area for you to find that information. Oops. And here, as I mentioned, if you want to drill down to see a particular entity, we've now actually also created a search feature and enhanced the search function on this page that starts out first with showing all the customized issuers, but then you can do a bit of a Boolean search where as you add in additional characters, you can actually find the entity, or you can also toggle to be able to determine whether or not you want to look at a particular city or a particular county from this page. You know, at any point in time, as I mentioned earlier, and I will continue to drive this home, as it relates to customizing your homepage, the MSRB support is always available from 7:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. Eastern daily to support in the customization process. So I will be sure to make sure that you are aware of these resources are available so that investors can actually see your page as well. So now I want to turn to the issuer homepage. And as I mentioned before, you can now see on this particular page, or the customized page, that we have the contact information for the issuer. There are additional resources. You can also select what types of view would you like to actually have. Here, it's essentially the one-stop shopping for all the information that's specifically related to this particular issuer. And you can also change in terms of the numbers of issues that you actually really want to see, from in terms of going from 10 as high as 50 transactions that have been provided for this particular issue. You can see the trade activity, the pre-sale documentation, and I'll talk a little bit more about the pre-sale documentation in a moment. But I want you to also want to note that one of the new enhancements that we've added to the issuer homepage, and as you see at the very top, is the Breadcrumb Trail. So from here, now you can go back and toggle back and forth between pages using the Breadcrumb Trail, so that if you want to go see the previous page or you want to actually go to another page, you can actually do that by clicking to the very top of the page itself. So also on this page, one of the things that in terms of the issuer detail page, we've now done a whole series of enhancements to make sure that in terms of having access to information. So from here in the issuer details page, you're able to see the full from the full final scale for a transaction, of a recent transaction that's been done in the market. There haven't been significant changes to this page generally, but in terms of your being able to click from the securities detail page to be able to reach the issuer details page is actually a new enhancement. Also, I just want to point out, if you might have noticed, at the very top of the page, we've actually also, when you're toggling between pages, you have a clear sense of what particular issue or issuer that you are looking on. And that blue box in terms of information now remains static. So you are clear as to the particular security, the particular issuer that you are currently examining at any point in time. This is actually, I'm going to say, one of the cooler pieces that we have developed, which is the securities detail overlay. And I share this with you in part as this is now part of, whenever you go to the securities detail page, this overlay will appear. And we did this based on some of the research that we had conducted with the investor community, that when people come into the Emma system, they frequently want to understand, like, what are all the bells and whistles and what am I supposed to do? Now, we know that recognize that Emma has now become a great deal more intuitive, but the overlay essentially provides, helps the new user become better oriented to the type of information that they actually are able to see on the Emma page. And so if you have not, some of you may have already seen this and in terms of your coming to Emma since April 30th, but I did want to highlight a couple things. One, to get out of this page, there is the X that's at the very top of the right page, of the screen, so be sure to click the X to make it go away. Which I just indicated right there. That's where the X is. You will see that on all the pages. One of the other things that I mentioned this before, and it's actually called a sticky header. So whenever you are looking at a particular CUSIP for an issuer, you will now have that information or that sticky header on every page that you've actually drilled down into when you're on the securities detail page. We wanted to make sure that that allows you to have familiarity with where you are, and you can click the issuer name or the issuer description, and that will take you back to the issuer detail page. As you can see here, and then you're very clear as to what CUSIP for what issue that you're currently looking at. Also in this blue box, you'll actually see that we have created what is the characteristics of the security. So this will always be in the blue box, and that information will be consistently provided. And that's also here, as I mentioned before, that you can actually see what security that you're looking at, what's the coupon and the maturity related to that specific security that you're looking at. And this is actually, we make sure that this is prominently featured with the price and the yield graphic that's actually to the right side of the screen. So that you can also simultaneously be able to view where the security actually has been trading. And you can also determine whether or not you want to see it on a yield basis or price basis, or you want in the time period by which you actually want to be able to review the particular security. So these have been some new features that we have added to Emma in terms of the security details page to give a better understanding of specific securities, where they've been trading, and then also, as importantly, to make it a bit more user-friendly, because of course, as you can see on the screen, the graph is relatively small. This will allow you to actually, you see the little magnifying glass, you can blow up the graphics so that you actually are better prepared to be, or equipped to be able to see exactly what's on the screen. There's also, related to this at the bottom, where there is a glide or sliding path that allows you to see more or less information. And so these are some of the new features that have been provided to the Emma page. And of course, you can always at any point in time look for additional resources or the continual disclosure information that's associated with a particular security that you're examining. But one other thing I do want to point to, so you're on this page. You've now been utilizing the graph, you've seen the information, this is a bond or a security that you're very interested in, you've looked at the continuing disclosure information, you looked at you've done some comparative analysis, and you recognize that, I'd really like to add this to my Emma alerts. So from this page, you can actually now sign up and add this to your My Emma alerts as well. So we wanted to make sure that in creating this securities detail page, that essentially you can find out all the information you could possibly imagine related to this particular security, and to be able to find the information all in one location. The trade activities page. So this has actually been one where we've actually tried to provide as much information in one location as possible, as I mentioned. And here you can see a trade summary in the trade activity page. And this also, in terms of the trade activity, you have three options to be able to view. You can look at the trade summary, you can look at trade details, but you can also search details. And this search is there's a new aspect of the trade activity page. You know, trade activity page has always been part of Emma, but the ability to search for a particular trade is something that's a new feature that's been added. I do also want to remind you that, as I mentioned, the sticky header is still there. So we still know what security that we are examining and that we're looking at. And this provides you the option to be able to navigate between the various other information that's available for that security, as well as to still have access to educational resources. So this is one of the newer features that's added to Emma, and I hope that you all will take an opportunity to sort of play around in the trade activity page as well. A couple other things I want to also just share in terms of the trade details page. And here, as I mentioned, you have the option, you can see the trade summary, you can see the trade details, you can see special condition indicators in terms of when the bonds were bought or sold. And so this information has remained consistent on Emma, but this is now all in one place. And then, of course, the new feature I mentioned, which is search, which allows you to actually, if you want to drill down even further, to look at particular types of trades. If you want to actually be able to select the types of transactions or the types of trades that were actually executed, be they were at the list offering price or the takedown, if they were into types of interdealer trades or brokerage trades, you now have the ability in the search feature to be able to execute that. So we've expanded search to be able to provide that information so that you can really get a sense of what transactions and trades have actually happened in a particular security in the marketplace. Ratings. And so I addressed the ratings question earlier, but one of the things in terms of the overall enhancement is that, as you can see, now there is a great deal more of information about ratings that have been that was previously provided on the rating section of Emma and for a particular security. And you know, now this is in part to provide this additional information to support investors and others that are using the Emma system to understand what the information that's presented, what it actually means, and what's being available. Overall, the tab itself has not changed dramatically other than to provide this additional information. So now I want to turn to looking at the disclosure tab. And I think this is actually really important to understand some of the enhancements that have been done to this page. And this is actually we designed the new Emma disclosure page to be a lot more comprehensive and to provide as much information in one spot to understand a particular issuer's disclosure that's available in terms of the documents that have been submitted to the Emma system. One of the important enhancements to this is as it relates to the official statements. You can now find pre-sale documentation if there have been pre-sale documents made available, and that includes via the preliminary official statement or the POS, a notice of sale, or other related documents. And then importantly, once the official statement is made available for that particular transaction, this information that was the pre-sale documents is then provided into the archive. And that those pre-sale documents will automatically be moved into the document archive section that is located at the very bottom of the page. And let's see if we get there. And you can see now, in terms of making this most comprehensive, it is organized so that one can find the official statements, the advance refunding documents, continuing disclosure information, And also in the continuing disclosure information, it's been further categorized so that you can see the event filings that have been provided. And then you can also see if there have been other financial or operating information or filings that have been provided by the issuer. And so it's organized in a manner that you can find it in a much more orderly fashion. Also, in terms of the posting date, this is also a feature that's been added so that you actually can see when it was actually posted to the site. And in addition to seeing exactly when information, you can now search to find out whether or not it's for 3 years, for 5 years, or if you can see all of it. So this is a feature that wasn't previously available on the MS system, and we've now updated it so that you can actually do that more granular search in terms of looking at continuing disclosure or disclosure information for a particular issuer. So I would encourage you, if you have not had an opportunity to look at this information, to also be sure to add that. I also just want to note that there is also available asset-backed filings. You know, there's some issuers that occasionally will do an asset-backed transaction, and that filing information would also be available and placed here under disclosure information. And so these are a couple things to keep aware of. Now, another enhancement has been in terms of being able to do the continuing disclosure searches. We had recognized that there were and have received lots of comments in terms of how this actually feature was working. And so the MSRB has undertaken similarly to enhance how search can actually be conducted when you're looking for continuing disclosure information. You can continue to be able to use the search through market activity and or through the advanced search, but we also added it to the navigation bar to make sure that it was a lot easier and more intuitive to be able to find that information. As I mentioned, we also, as you can see here at the bottom of the page, there is, and so this allows you to search essentially by filing date or by posting date, and you can run the search for the particular continuing disclosure information. Also, you should note, at any point their document has been replaced or updated, because we know that at times information, there may be the need for supplement. That information would also, in terms of the old information, would then be moved to the archive. It has been the practice and the policy at the MSRB for once documents are uploaded into the system and they are not removed from the system. And in fact, they are actually put into the document archive. In their next phase of the enhancements, there will be some activity around potentially enhancing some of the archive features in terms of notification, or in terms of dates and notification or notices on those archive documents. But I did want to point that out and make you aware of that. Also, as I indicated, there is the final scale tab. So a lot of times when there's a transaction in the market, it's priced, it was on the calendar, there's an interest to understand what was the final transaction or what was the final scale for that transaction. So now we've actually included a tab where you can find that information. You can also access this information from the issuer details page, but this is another, and also from the issuer calendar. But we wanted to make sure that this was also a feature in terms of providing the comprehensive one-stop location for information on a particular issuer and security that you were able to find it. So this is something I would also point out to you. And then getting to the compare page. We know that in many times that there is the need to look at transactions, both in terms of comparing them from a rating standpoint, from a pricing standpoint. And so we've also added to this page a compare, which allows you to actually compare securities details using the price discovery tool. So instead of going, you now have multiple ways to actually utilize the price discovery tool that's actually been created on the MS system. Importantly, you should note that if you are in the sticky page, much of the information will already be pre-populated, so you don't have to re-enter that information again. And this way, on this page, you can do side-by-side comparisons. You can do trade pricing, the trade pricing graph. Then also you can do a trade yield graph. So you have several options in terms of being able to compare information from the compare standpoint, from the compare table. And, almost in terms of another feature or enhancement that's been done in terms of variable rate debt. Much of any of you have actually issued variable rate debt or underwriters that have served as remarketing agents for transaction, you'll be aware, or you may be aware, that that information is provided to the short system on EMMA, which is one of our other market transparency systems, also known as the short-term rate transparency platform. And so in the short system, we've now integrated it more into the EMMA system. And it's not part of the fixed rate securities, but also it's fixed rate securities detail section, but now has its own section so that you can actually, if you have variable rate debt or you want to see more about variable rate debt, you're now able to see the minimum denomination that's provided for a transaction, its minimum rate, its max rate, as well as information about the remarketing agent. And this information, of course, can be graphed in terms of what the rate history has been, in terms of the rate resets for that variable rate information. And of course, as I mentioned, you still have the feature to be able to expand the graphic, as well as to see additional information on that particular security, as well as the remarketing documents that are associated with that variable rate transaction, which you can see here on the right-hand side of the page as well. Resources, we make sure that they are always available. So if you've got questions or want additional information, and the disclosure information for those particular securities are also available on this page. And with that, I would encourage you to spend some time on the new EMMA. We've got lots of new bells and whistles. There'll be additional enhancements that will be forthcoming in the next several years. So continue to stay tuned, sign up for MSRB updates so that when enhancements are being made, you'll be the first to know as well. I would encourage you also to spend time to sort of surf around and see how you can customize EMMA to be a benefit as you're doing research on other municipal securities to keep track of your transactions. And if you have not customized your issuer homepage, this is the third time I've mentioned it, fourth time today, be sure as a homework assignment at the end of today's symposium that you would take the opportunity to call the MSRB or email us and be sure to customize your issuer homepage. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Yes? That's correct. So the process now is it's on a voluntary basis in terms of submission or posting of preliminary official statements. And as I mentioned, once the official statement has been posted by the underwriter, that POS automatically goes to the archive. Yes. Yes. And generally, but that's with the issuer's permission. And then sometimes issuers also will post in terms of a voluntary basis in terms of posting their material, their information. But it's, it's really the issuer's option. Other questions? I know I went through a lot of information quickly, so I'd encourage you to be sure to spend some time. The slide deck is also available if you wanted to walk through and see other types of bells and whistles as it relates to using the EMMA platform. Very great. Thank you all for your time and attention.
So I'm Dave Hitchcock. I'm out of Standard & Poor's. Well, actually, we're no longer Standard & Poor's. It's like instead of Kentucky Fried Chicken, it's KFC now. We're S&P Global, but formerly Standard & Poor's. I'm a senior director in our states group, and I'm going to talk a little bit about credit trends nationally. Utah, as you'll see, comes off looking pretty good when you look at national trends. But when I look at some of the problems that the states are facing nationally, I would submit that some of them, like in Connecticut, New Jersey, Illinois, might be a little bit like canaries in the coal mine. And I don't believe that the localities in Utah are necessarily immune to some of these national forces that are occurring. It might be more of a delayed effect, it might be less of an effect because of demographics, but they are affecting everybody nationally. So this is like the big confusing criteria page, we have in our state rating criteria, it's 22 pages, and there's a lot that goes into it, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but the basic idea is there's 5 main factors. So we look at the structure, government structure, which is how the Constitution, for example, secures bondholders. We look at financial management, budgeting practices, particularly as written and codified. We look at those also for local governments, which I'll mention later. We look at the economy, which is very important, obviously, and indicates future trends. We look at actual budgetary performance. So you could have the best financial management policies in the world. For example, Puerto Rico had very strong written policies, but sort of like the Chinese constitution that guarantees rights to everybody, it's not always followed. So we look at how it's followed, and then we look at the debt and liability profile, and we don't look at just debt, but we also look at pension and OPEB, or other post-employment benefits, primarily medical costs. And then there's overrides. For example, someone says they're not going to pay the debt, even though they have everything else. That would be a negative factor. We saw that in Puerto Rico. But so just to boil it down, states are rated pretty highly. 2/3 of the ratings, as you'll see, are AAA, AA+, AA. Large, diverse economies, usually but not always, they have the ability to raise revenues and cut expenditures. Sometimes state constitutions or voter initiatives limit that. There's counter-cyclical elements, so that when economies go down, the federal government can provide extra help, and they have extra status with the federal government. We saw that in the last Great Recession, when a lot of states got extra aid from the federal government. So you look at our state rating distribution. These are the top. These are AAA, AA+, AA. So most of them are here. Then we have a few that are low rated. So Illinois is our lowest rated state at BBB, not because their economy is in trouble, but because they have budgetary problems. They have a gridlock. One side wants to spend on one thing, another side doesn't want to raise taxes, so they compromise by borrowing. New Jersey's done a little bit of that way, only they compromise by not funding their pension system. Kentucky, similar. They've had some pension problems in the past. Connecticut's got some special issues. Pennsylvania's got some budgetary issues. There's a big split in the country between different sides that have a harder time apparently agreeing on future policy. But with those caveats, generally states are relatively highly rated. And I'll get into the reason why there's a divergence between some states that are probably heading in the wrong way and others are probably heading in the right way. And that, you can see that most of our states are rated stable, but there's more states with a negative outlook than positive outlook. And I'll get into that too. And if you look at the rating state movements, basically over the last 5 years, they've been mostly on the negative side, particularly in 2016 and 2017. And that might seem surprising because that's when the economy really started to hit on all cylinders. And I'll get into some of the reasons behind that. And some of those reasons that are affecting those states, we're finding that some of the state budgetary solutions is to push some of their problems down onto localities. And I'm not, Utah is our AAA rated state, relatively good shape, better demographics than a lot of the country, so maybe they'll be the last state where we see some of those factors happening. But we are seeing it, and at the same point, it's possible the federal government could be pushing some of their problems down onto the states. And this is part of the reason. So states have a hard time funding entitlements. You can see the change in Medicaid enrollment goes down during the good times, goes up during the bad times. That's exactly when state tax revenue is cyclical. typically states depend on sales tax and income tax. Income tax was more stable in this last recession than sales tax. It was the reverse, the one before that. But you can see just when they need the revenue, they have to pay more for Medicaid in particular. And you can see the long-term trend here. So total state tax revenues is the line at the bottom. It's never good when you're at the line at the bottom. And you can see Medicaid is the line at the top. And then that's total. It's not always all paid from general fund. So this is the general fund of all the states. So this comes from the National Association of State Business Officers and the Rockefeller Institute. And then, so what's the effects? You can see expenditures, Medicaid going up, but look at the effect on other things. So K-12 education, high priority, but it's not getting funded at nearly this increase, the Medicaid. And you can see higher education is the loser. And that's because it has less restrictions generally in a lot of states. So let's just get a little bit more granular on state revenue growth. So this is, if you index to prior recessions, you can see this is what's happened since the last recession. State revenue growth has been very, very slow. So going into the 9th year, they're just coming back if you index to 100, whereas in other recessions generally grew. And that was in real terms, not inflation adjusted. And then you look even more granular at the type. So the personal income tax has grown most strongly. Corporate income tax has grown least strongly. And then other sales taxes and total taxes there. So what's happened? States have had to cut. So they're paying more for Medicaid, entitlements. And if you look at state government employment, you find that private payrolls took a big dip during the recession, but then they've come back strongly. Right about here, you can see that if you index to 100, the state payrolls have been pretty flat, actually come down slightly, but the private hasn't kept pace nearly with the private enrollment, or not enrollment, payroll. And then I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly, but just if you're not familiar with Medicaid, it's a combined state federal program. There's a lot of variation in how much each state gets paid. The average is 57% of the FMAP, which is the federal medical assistance percentage, but it ranges from 50% to 75%. Maximum allowed reimbursement that's not Obamacare is 83%. So ACA or Obamacare. So it expanded who is eligible. So if your household income goes up to 133%, you're eligible. Not all states, like Utah, has not expanded Medicaid, but it's you get more money. So it's a lot of these people that aren't getting Medicaid because the state didn't expand still can become indigent and end up on the state rolls, but maybe later. So it's not always so clear what the costs are, but generally it is a higher cost. The federal government started paying 100%, then it phases down to 90% of the reimbursement for the additional expansion by 2020. So states are also now having to start to pay more because they have to pick up a greater share of that cost. And then you have other problems too. So you have demographics. We're getting older, and if you look at the percent of growth in Medicaid versus other expenses or just Medicaid spending, it's growing much faster. So again, you're getting squeezed, and that's why the state payrolls are getting squeezed. And the even K-12 education is getting squeezed a bit. You look at the CPI for medical cost, higher. The blue line at the bottom is the overall CPI, and the medical CPI cost is higher. These trends don't seem to have any reason why they're not going to continue as they have. So if you project out far enough, you can see there might be some problems. And then, as you'd expect, overall Medicaid costs are growing up. The percentage share from the federal government is growing more, and that's why I say the federal government might be having problems someday that they'll have to push down on the states, because the trend seems unsustainable. But states are paying more. But if you look at the share, the state share has come down slightly, and the federal share has come up slightly, at least through 2014 with this. So I don't want to beat up on Medicaid anymore. But it's a serious problem, and it's squeezing all the states. So we look at the liability side. So the problem is that states are getting squeezed in their entitlements and their fixed costs. So the other fixed costs, and we weight these equally when we rate state liabilities, is debt, pension, and OPEB. So OPEB is actually weighted equally under our criteria with debt, for example. Debt has actually been relatively level across the country. Of course, there's some variations in certain areas. But we do a survey every year, and we add up the liabilities. And if we actually look at the total liabilities that are on the audits, the CAFRs, debt liability is only 26% of the total. OPEB is 33%, and the net pension liability is 41%. And that's been growing, that percentage, because we do this survey yearly. But just quickly to dispose of the debt. So this is what we consider as high or low debt. Most states have relatively low debt. Some states have high debt. If we look at the amount of debt service that they pay as a percent of the whole budget, and there's a couple states, I don't know if you want to call them the canaries in the coal mine or not, but Hawaii and Connecticut are a little different because they don't really have functioning county governments. So the states pick up debt that would normally be issued by counties in those states. But on the other hand, it's a fixed cost that they have to pay. So when Connecticut just picked up the cost of the city of Hartford's debt, which was insolvent, so they just guaranteed $540 million. Now it's on their balance sheet. They have to pay it. So it's not as if Connecticut comes in with a big presentation saying, well, if you adjust for counties, we're actually in the middle of the pack. Well, you're still paying it, so you don't get off the hook. New Jersey is another case. They have county government, but they just have a lot of debt. But if you look at the overall trend, so here's some of the four main debt ratios that we look at, and you can see the trend has been pretty stable for the most part. So debt's, in some cases, a problem if you live in New Jersey, like I do, but mostly not. But pension, that's another story. So part of the problem, as I mentioned on entitlements, the states have to pick up bigger entitlements when they have less money to pay in a recession, and the pension investment returns go down in the recession, right when they might want to actually boost some of their payments. So they've had some pretty weak investment returns since for the last 10 years. And then some have weaker assumptions. And investment returns are only one assumption. There's many, many assumptions. We hired 2 actuaries on our staff, and I learned more about actuarial analysis than I ever wanted to know. But it made me realize that investment returns is only one part of the overall weak assumptions that many of them have. There's many ways to play with the assumptions to make your pension fund look better than it really is. And then you have demographic funds. A lot of the actuarial assumptions assume 3% growth continually in state employment for state workers on the payroll. As I showed you before, the payrolls are flat. So right away, you've got a problem. So a lot of them promise very generous payouts, benefits, assuming that the people in the future are going to contribute and pay for that. Those people aren't appearing, so each year they have to readjust their actuarial study, and it looks worse, but it'll be worse because they're not forward-looking to say that they're not going to have that growth. And there's a number of other assumptions like that that probably making it worse than it actually looks when they do the actuarial study. So you'll be happy to know. So we look at the funding progress. So this is the line in the middle, what you need to pay to keep basically on track, so you pay off all your liabilities and have a fully funded pension system. And you can see most of them in 2016. So this is our most recent survey for using the CAFRs in 2016. The red is where they don't base their actual funding of the pensions on an actuarial basis, but they can still sometimes fund more than 100. Others don't do it, and they're in problems. So New Jersey is way at the bottom. So they had the highest debt, and they have the weakest pension funding. But here's Utah, actually funded more than they had to, which is good. So that's good. Blue is when it's actuarially based funding. That's good. And so another reason a lot of the pension liabilities are increasing is because they're coming up with more realistic rates of return assumptions, which is also the discount rate. So you're discounting the future liabilities based on the investment rate of return. This would be considered very high in the corporate world, where you need to use a AA long-term rate. I don't think you can get a municipal rate or corporate rate anywhere close to 7%, for example, but that's considered low now for a investment assumption in the municipal world. So what we're finding is some states, like Utah, have been funding each year what they should. They have reasonable actuarial assumptions, discount rates, and they're maintaining trends of funding that are close to 100% or healthy. And then the states that got caught behind, they can never catch up, because each year you don't fund your full actuarial contribution, or ADC. You fall further behind, it grows the next year, and then it becomes even harder. So we're finding states like New Jersey, Kentucky are just getting worse and worse. So we're finding a bifurcation, that some states are heading downward and others don't seem to be that affected. And so we do a survey, as I said, every year, also of pensions, and you can see the worst funded ones are the darkest color, so Illinois, Kentucky, New Jersey. You got some other states in the South that aren't doing so well. So maybe I'll skip over this in the interest of time, because we started a bit late, but basically you want to be in this end of the graph. So this is the funded ratio versus the average rate of return variance from what they're assumed from what they actually achieved. So this would be positive variance. So they got more than what they were assuming actuarial. And you can see almost everybody here is getting less than they're actually saying that they're going to get in their actuarial assumption. There's some other things here too. We have some by colors, by what's aggressive or not. So I know you've got copies of the slides. You can look at it later. One thing we're finding is that states are moving to riskier investments. The state treasurer here can comment about if there's any pressure to move to riskier investments to try to meet the actuarial rate of return for these perhaps high assumptions. So we're seeing a movement for reform in the states. The better states, from a credit perspective, are making some reforms, COLA reductions and so forth. Not so good maybe for the employees, but the pension system's on a sounder footing. OPEB, some of the same suspects. So you see New Jersey has really high OPEB per capita. Connecticut, Alaska, you wouldn't expect. We've got very high reserves from oils, but that's a legacy because they've moved to a 401k style pension system. And you look at the OPEB funded ratios. Most states, or a lot of states, don't really fund their OPEB. They pay it on a pay-as-you-go. But here's Utah doing pretty well at the bottom, so that's pretty good. that just to have any sort of funding at all. So this isn't all 50 states because a lot of them just have no chart. No, it'd be just nothing, zero. So if you have something, you're on the chart. But a lot don't even have any pre-funded OPEB fund. So we do our own survey, as I said, for OPEB pension debt. Each year, if you add up the liabilities, you have here at the bottom, you have Nebraska with very little. I don't think they even have OPEB or offer it. And then you have Illinois, which is our lowest rated state with very high liabilities. And this is based on audited GAAP, CAFR statistics. And then you see Utah down here pretty well off. And this is a different source. So this is the National Association of Business Officers. So this is more current on a budgetary basis. And I just throw it in for comparison because the numbers change a little bit. So Illinois is fourth here. And that's not using GAAP-based valuations for the pensions. So a lot of the pensions, the riskier states use perhaps very aggressive assumptions, maybe unwarranted assumptions on their pension liability. So it'll make them look a little better. I don't have to see where New Jersey is, but they're going to look a little better because they think they're better off if you include a sale to themselves or the lottery fund and so forth. But it gives you, it's basically relatively similar. And I just throw this in for the city. So these are the 15 largest cities, but you can see there's a wide variation even among cities between Philadelphia and Chicago, for example, if you take OPEB, debt service, and pension together. So it's a good thing there's rating agency analysts that can cut the difference and tell you what's strong and what's weak. So Utah, these are just some of the bullet points I took from our last, let's see, how many pages is it? 8 or 9 pages. So I'd be happy to email our last Utah state write-up if anyone's interested. It talks about the state's debt and pensions and OPEB and budgetary situation, but the state's rated AAA, which is our highest rating. Once I had an issuer say, well, why aren't we quadruple A? But most people I think should be satisfied with the AAA, which is our highest rating. And low debt. We talked about the post-employment. Utah is funding a OPEB trust fund. Economy is diverse. You got the demographics here. So we have places like Maine, which is losing population. Vermont has just started a program where they'll pay young people $10,000 to move to the state. They're starting to lose population. They're getting older, sicker, need more Medicaid. They got some problems. It's not a problem necessarily that Utah has. And Dave, I don't always talk about this in the meetings because it's a given and we know about it, but these are some of the strengths that Utah has, and we do put in our write-up. I wanted to talk briefly because I know a lot of you issue sales tax bonds. We have a proposal to change the criteria for sales tax and gas tax and what we call priority lien. Priority lien would be tax revenues that you have a gross lien before operation. So you're saying the lien has a priority above everything else. And what we found over the last 10 years or so is that courts have been eating away at that, politicians have been eating away at that, and we're going to propose, if we release this, to make a couple changes, one of which would tie the priority lien rating or sales tax rating to a general obligation or issuer credit rating. We had a comment period for this. One of the changes we're going to talk about later is what Dodd-Frank has done, so we're more transparent with our criteria. We have comment periods. We released this proposal. The comment period ended in January. Be happy to send it. It's 18 pages, so maybe it's better to listen to my summary. But I'm not going to cover everything in it. I'm going to cover the highlights, which I think you're most interested in. So I don't want to represent that it covers everything, and the final criteria could be different because we're going over the comments right now. Just in brief, it's an 18-page criteria. There's three main factors: economic factors, coverage, and this is the revenue volatility. So it would adjust, for example, coverage. So hotel tax would be more volatile than sales tax. And then there's various overrides for different things, willingness to pay, for example. These are, I think, some key points. The coverage numbers really don't change. The criteria really isn't too much different than what we're doing now for sales tax. It's just making it maybe a little more quantitative. And some of the coverage numbers that we're looking at maybe about the same as what we're looking at now. And when we're looking at the coverage, we're looking at future coverage. So if you have an additional bonds test that keeps you at 2 times coverage, we say 2 times coverage. But if you have 2 times coverage and your additional bonds test is 1 times, we would, and we believe that there could be additional debt, we would count that in our matrix as closer to 1 times coverage, even if it was currently 2. This is the key thing that everyone's interested in, Table 6 on the proposal. So most run-of-the-mill sales tax bonds would be 1 notch above the issuer credit rating or GO rating. And that's where you don't have a lockbox type of mechanism or a third party like a state that directly transmits things to debt service to the trustee. In certain cases, we could go 2 notches above the GO rating, where we believe there's been a very strong legal separation between the payment of the revenues and the collection, because usually the same issuer is collecting that's paying. But we could go 2 notches. And 4 notches is a case where it's like a true sale. So like a Ford Motor Credit sells their car receivable payments for the loan payments to a third party, and they have no legal recourse to that. That might be a true sale, and so we don't rate those structured finance issues based on Ford Motor, but as a structured issue. So this would be basically for structured issues. And there might be more, I realize there might be more questions in the panel afterwards on that. Just briefly, local government criteria. Again, we have I'd be happy to send the criteria for people, but it's similar. We look at the legal framework, the economy, management, financial measures, debt and liability with various adjustments for different things. Just wanted to show a little bit about the outlook. So this is local government revenues. You can see they got hit very hard with the last recession nationally. Local government employment has come back, but it's basically where it was. This is a little bit out of date because it was done last quarter, but you can see there's big regional variations in growth. The Rocky Mountain area has done quite well. Tax reform has created some uncertainty. High tax states might have the real estate affected. It's a little unclear. We see different things from different economists, what the impact on the real estate prices and assessed value will be. We're seeing all sorts of different things, like in Atlanta, there was the cyber attack. There's a trend of different things. We don't know how imposition of tariffs nationally is going to affect various regional economies. So there's a lot of things going on that have specific regional effects. Transportation funding, I'm just throwing it in here. It's one of the things that's getting hit. Everybody's favor of transportation funding, but it's been really hit by the entitlement squeeze. So you can see federal funding has not kept up. State revenues haven't kept up. Gas tax revenues are inflation adjusted in most cases. They're per gallon taxes, haven't kept up. The states have been reluctant to raise gas taxes. So 26 states have over the last 5-year period, but certainly not a majority of the states. And then you see Medicaid funding again, the old bugaboo going up, and transportation funding pretty flat. And we see at the federal government, the plans are to try to have partnerships, try to leverage local funds. So we're not really optimistic that there's going to be major funding there. So that is an issue. So there's a lot of, I've been emphasizing Medicaid at the state level, but there's K-12 education, there's lots of things, corrections, a lot of pressures, a lot of fixed costs for some states. So even though you'd think that the outlook would be rosy with the strong economy, it isn't necessarily at the state level. And then we see the political risk of bifurcation. A lot of states, the governor and the legislature are at it, or different branches of the legislature. One of the problems in Illinois, for example. And then we're not seeing rainy day funds at the state level being built up to the level they were before. So that could perhaps make states more vulnerable in the next recession. And then I just thought I'd throw it in here. Internet sales are about 9% of overall sales. There's an issue trying to get the sales tax. Amazon has now agreed to give sales tax on what they directly provide. So they're about 40% of internet sales, but they're only about half of them are direct Amazon. The rest is their marketplace. So there's still been a loss. We'll see on Monday. The Supreme Court should rule on the South Dakota Wayfair decision, whether states can require third-party internet providers, even if they're out of state, to provide sales tax. A lot of states have found ways around that. I'd be happy to discuss that later, but I think we're probably running a little short on time. But states are finding some solutions. They're even saying that cookies on your computer is a nexus that requires you to report your sales tax. And there'll be a lot of litigation if to litigate the validity of that, unless the Supreme Court just obviates it to begin with. And then there's always some states that have something weird. So there's oil states are like on their own cycle. So Alaska, New Mexico, they do well when everyone else does badly. They do well. They do poorly when other states are doing well. So we're seeing some of that. But fortunately, most of them built up some pretty big reserves, over 300% of expenditures at the peak for Alaska and Wyoming. It's about 1.5 times. It's not here because it's annualized. They have a biennial budget. So that's about it. I'd be happy to provide copies of our criteria, State of Utah write-up, the party lien proposal. We also have frequently asked questions about the party lien and the sales tax criteria. So there could be some major changes before the end of the year if we roll that out. And I'd be happy to talk about trends and Dodd-Frank. I think is going to come up in the panel. So I think trying to bring us back on time here. I think that's it. Did you want to have questions or?
Oh, now can you hear me? Okay. I could listen to Dave Hitchcock forever. Enjoy listening to him. This panel is a public finance toolbox panel. We're going to deal with several issues, and we probably won't get to all of them, but let me introduce the panelists. On the far side is Ruth Pan. She's with the Goldman Sachs. Covers Utah as an underwriter out of Los Angeles, and Ruth knows everything about old movies. Try to stump her. Next to Ruth is Jason Birmingham. He's the Birmingham and Lewis Young Robertson of Birmingham. Lives in Bountiful, and he hits the golf ball a country mile. Next to him is Kevin O'Brien. Kevin is with Bank of America Merrill Lynch out of Los Angeles, and Kevin is their P3 expert at BAML. And he loves to fly fish and was recently up on the Snake River fly fishing. So we're going to start with P3s. P3 stands for Public-Private Partnership, and the term is pretty nebulous. It's hard to defined. People have different definitions, and that makes telling if P3 financings are successful or not because people define them different ways. So I'm just going to ask the panelists how they each would define a P3. Start with Ruth.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? No? Closer? Better? Just eat it. All right. So I think, there's many different definitions of public-private partnership. As John mentioned, I think the simplest definition I would make is that it's essentially meant to be a risk transfer from a governmental entity to the private sector, whether it's from a financing standpoint, a design standpoint, an operations and maintenance standpoint, and it's for a service or a product that the government, local or state, typically delivers, and that the private sector also has the ability to design, build, finance, operate, maintain, any and all of the above.
Yeah, I think it is a nebulous term. We've been involved in a number of projects that have involved public and private entities that have participated in financing. And so I think, it's maybe been indicated that anytime you have a public entity and a private entity participating on a project, then it must be a P3. And I think it is nebulous, and because of that, it's difficult to kind of determine which is really a P3, what is not a P3. So I kind of agree with Ruth. What we've seen is that the key concept is to transfer risk from the public entity, whether it's state, local, government, to a private participant, an investor or an equity participant or a developer that has an interest in certain critical capital infrastructure. I've looked at it as being kind of capital intensive. P3s tend to work when it's a very significant capital project that has long-term, broad public benefit, and where the investment community or a developer has a certain incentive in terms of a return on investment to get that infrastructure in place. So kind of using that broader definition, I think there's almost an unquantifiable number of opportunities where you could apply P3s. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little more about those.
I think they've covered most of the elements of it. I would say the way I view P3s is more of a spectrum, so that I think the key ingredient is, again, you have a public sponsor, public owner as we refer to them, as well as a private entity, which can come in the form of 100% debt participation or equity, depending on the nature of the risk transfer. But at the end of the day, it can be a design build transaction to something that's a complete P3, as we call it, design, build, finance, operate, maintain, for a period of time. And the other element to this is these are contract structures. So generally we think about P3s in the context of a long-term agreement, referred to oftentimes as a concession. But the key is when you have the private party involved, they're generally looking for some long-term involvement. So these are long-term agreements. I've seen them sort of in the 25 to 50-year range as a common feature.
I won't add too much to say, except that we might add them as debt to the balance sheet when we're doing our analysis, depending on the structure. Maybe, maybe not. As we said, there's many different types of structure. If it's a fixed cost that has to be paid, fixed liability over a long period of time.
Terrific. Let's ask Kevin and Ruth to both point out one P3 project that you've been involved with, describe it, and especially describe the benefit to the governmental issuer.
So the project that I would like to highlight is the one that we just recently closed on behalf of a concessionaire team for the Los Angeles World Airports. So some of you may be familiar. It's called the Automated People Mover Project. So if anyone has ever flown into LAX, most people try to avoid it, but if you do, it's heavily congested. It's going through a very ambitious construction program, terminal modernization. The airport has generally been using a lot of the terminal expansion to be financed via airlines. Essentially, the airlines are acting as their agents, but at the end of the day, LAX, or LAWA as it's referred to, is acquiring these improvements and taking the financing risk. They decided to do the People Mover as a true P3, design, build, finance, operate, maintain, for 30 years. And they did it for a couple of reasons, and this is why I think when I talk about why I think it makes sense for P3, this is a good example. LAX is in the business of delivering air travel services, maintaining relationships with airlines, but their core function is the transportation of cargo and passengers. They are not in the business of operating essentially a people mover, which is a transit, light rail type facility. So they went out and realized this isn't our core competency. We wanted to go out and bring in the private sector to come in and operate this, design, build, construct, and operate this transit. What was important about the process, and I think that one of the elements of a P3 is you look for innovation when you pursue P3s, not just risk transfer, but hopefully some innovation in design. And this project actually captured one of the benefits of that, and that LAX originally anticipated they'd have to essentially demolish a couple of their parking garages, which sit in the middle of their horseshoe terminal design. And when they put it out to bid, our concession team that I was working with ended up coming up with a design that avoided having the need to demo or essentially demolish these two parking garages. And as a result of that, not only did it save on the cost of essentially demolishing and then rebuilding the garage, but it allowed LAX to continue to receive revenues from these parking garages as a result of the design innovation. So it was a good example of not only why they did it, which is that it isn't their core competency, but they got the innovation benefits out of it as well. And at the end of the day, the other key, and we can talk about this a little further, is when it came time to price the bonds in this transaction, they priced very, very close to where LAWA's general airport revenue bonds priced, simply because investors are looking for incremental yield, and at the end of the day, they viewed it as a very strong concessionaire team, and once the project's built, LAWA is obligated to make payments. So I think for the most part, the cost of capital, which is another element of these discussions, was taken off the table by the very aggressive response from investors.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. Another example that our firm, Goldman and I, have worked on is for the Denver Regional Transportation District, and that is the transit agency for the area surrounding Denver. In 2004, they passed an additional sales tax to significantly expand their transit system. So as a transit operator and agency, obviously that is our core competency in terms of expanding commuter rail lines, buying more trains, expanding service throughout the Denver region. But the program was so large in terms of so many regions, so many new lines, that the sales tax ability to absorb all that upfront capital costs to build the new lines, finance the trains, et cetera, was very, very great. And so for a portion of that project, for two rail lines, the East Line, the Gold Line, they decided to do a P3 model. And in this case, what they were able to do was they were able to leverage private financing from a consortium of investors that consisted of people who have a lot of experience designing, building, operating, and maintaining commuter rail lines. And at the same time, that help incentivize the federal government through the full funding grant agreement that the FTA puts out to really accelerate their grant for this overall project. So what it was able to do was about a $2.2 billion financing overall. They were able to get over $1 billion of federal funding via a grant, which they were able to show they had to then innovative finance and bring in the private sector to help move forward these projects. And they're able to get $450 million of private financing, which enabled them to deploy their sales tax dollars to other projects throughout the region. So enable them to deliver more projects overall by doing one component of it as a P3. Two of the lines have since opened, and once the lines have opened, what Denver RTD does is they make an availability payment to the concessionaire, in this case, the operator and maintainer of these rail lines and these rail cars, for making the system available to Denver RTD. And so this enabled, again, the agency to complete more projects overall, leverage federal funding more efficiently, and just provide projects on time and at a combined, blended, very attractive cost of capital.
So Jason and David, what other reasons do governments do P3 projects for? What are they looking for?
Well, I think there are a number of other benefits. What we've found is that often local government looks at the cost of capital to begin with. And when they look at tax-exempt markets and what they might be able to borrow for critical infrastructure, they often stop there, because when they look beyond that and the private equity markets, private capital comes into it, often the cost of capital is much higher than what they could otherwise do it. So without looking at it more comprehensively at the other cost benefits associated with it, oftentimes we dismiss P3s pretty quickly and don't use them. I think some of the other benefits that I can think of include sometimes private sector can deliver construction, procurement, and facilities and buildings in a much more cost-effective way than the local government or even state government might be able to procure that. So there's cost savings there. So if you evaluate that also in light of the differential between the interest rates, sometimes that offsets whatever benefit the tax-exempt markets might have. Another interesting one I think of is timing of when the risk is. A lot of local governments don't really follow the model of field of dreams. Build it and they will come. I think the risk profile of the public sector is if we know growth is coming, then we anticipate it, build it, construct it. But a lot of times to take a huge capital investment, put that on our balance sheet, recognizing that takes some of the bonding capacity of our local government, it's much easier to say that's a huge risk, and we'd rather push that onto the private sector. That's hard to quantify, but there is an element of huge benefit there. The last one I thought of was really as an economic incentive tool. We don't necessarily in this state think of P3s as being tax increment financing, but in many aspects, we've seen where tax increment financing has been a way to accelerate significant public infrastructure in anticipation of large developments that will come immediately as well as over the life of the infrastructure improvements. And so I think it also can be a tool to accelerate economic development without taking a lot of the risk associated with stranded capital in public infrastructure. So I think if you evaluate all those in the context of not just the interest rate differential, sometimes P3s might make some sense to use.
I guess I would second that. I think most municipalities and states just make a very cold-blooded decision, which costs less. And there's been a lot more talk about P3s than probably actually action, because I think I'd agree when you actually look at it, you have the same source financing taxes, but somebody else is taking a cut of that, and it's pretty hard to compete against that. But there are cases where maybe a private entity wants to take on the risk. Someone from Australia comes in and they want to enter the U.S. market for some reason. They're going to take a risk on whatever it is, and maybe then it makes sense that something that a municipality wouldn't do on their own. But there's probably been more talk actually than action. I've been around in this business 40 years, and last 10 years there's been a lot of talk, but maybe not as much action.
Okay, I'm just going to clarify something here, and that is that you heard Jason make reference to it, and then David as well, that P3s have various pieces to them. And if you ask the private sector to finance a project, say the new state prison, for example, they had P3 providers come in and talk about financing the prison using a P3. Well, the public sector, the state can borrow money right now at 3% for the prison, or below 3%. The private sector starts with prime plus 1 or 2 at best, and then they add their profit margin on, and so the interest cost that they charge for their P3 project is multiples of what the state's borrowing cost would be for the prison. And all the providers, the P3 providers for the prison, came in and acknowledged that. But what you're hearing is that there may be other benefits that offset.
So for the private prison, maybe they don't have a correction guard union in that private prison that can lower the costs. So the intangible, what you're saying.
Right. Okay, so that we've taken care of that question now. I'm going to ask Kevin to talk about the Ohio State University P3 deal that he did, followed by Ruth, who's going to talk about one that she did recently or that Goldman did recently for Granite School District here in Utah?
So we actually worked with a bidding team. Unfortunately, our team didn't win on that transaction, but we're also involved in other higher ed activity or representation now for projects that are yet to be public. But that's one area where we're starting to see a lot of interest is in the higher ed space. And I slightly disagree with David's description of P3s and the benefits. I know people talk about cost of capital, but you have to really think about the context of the discussion needs to start with risk transfer, because essentially what the market is doing is pricing risk transfer. And the cost of equity versus debt discussion gets kind of complicates or confuses the issue here. So in the higher ed space, they're making the same decision. Most of them have utility assets that are on campus. It's not a core function generally of the university. It's a vitally important one because they need to make sure that the utility, the heating, the electricity, the research labs are all never put at risk in terms of the electricity generation or steam or chiller facilities, whatever. But they're realizing now I have these assets, we've invested in them, I can transfer those assets. Oftentimes they'll do it with some consideration of an upfront payment and then transferring the obligation to maintain those assets for the term of the concession, including future improvements. Also allows them to implement energy conservation measures, which are becoming very important, sustainability standards, things of that sort. Again, the private sector, in their view, can do this more effectively. Going to the concept of the reason they can achieve lower costs is because they lay off, union workers. In fact, I think that trend is just the opposite. Oftentimes they're coming in and they're agreeing not only to retain the existing employees, because who knows that asset better? These employees have had a long history with it. So they're coming in, they want to make sure they get the benefit of that expertise. But in some cases, and in many cases, they're actually going to turn around and then negotiate a collective bargaining agreement. So the idea of the union being cut out of the equation generally is not necessarily the picture. And at the end of the day, what's important to understand is, and Ruth can talk about this as well, is an availability payment arrangement means that you're being the public owner, in this case, let's say the university, is paying the concessionaire based on their ability to make the asset available. And if they fail to do that, they fail to hit these performance metrics, they're assessed penalty deductions, payment deductions. So they're at risk. So that's the need for equity, essentially. But when we talk about the financing costs, we don't talk about in terms of the cost of equity. We talk about it in the concept, in terms of the weighted average cost of capital. Because oftentimes they're putting mostly debt to help finance their upfront payment or their obligations with a relatively small percentage of equity. And that weighted average cost of capital needs to be compared to what you could do if you took on that risk yourself. But that's the key. Are you taking on that risk, or have you transferred that risk? And they price the risk based on that transfer.
So John asked me to talk about a project we've done as a firm with the Granite School District, and it is a kind of P3. It's what it's called a social impact bond, and you may have heard about it. The state of Utah was one of the first to do this in partnership with Goldman Sachs and another investor. And it's a similar idea in that it's also a type of risk transfer. So if you think of a social impact bond, what it is that an investor invests money and is only paid back if certain outcomes are met. And so in this case, it's a program for early education in Granite and Park City School District. And there have been a lot of studies done that early education, preschool in effect, especially for lower income families, underprivileged communities, can make a really big difference over time for the student and for the local district and the state who's providing special education services. So there's a lot of studies done that early education, preschool programs that have been studied and evaluated can really help in the long term provide significant savings to the state and local governments in reducing the amount of special services that are required throughout, K through 12th grade. So what we did in 2013 is there was a $7.8 million loan that was made to fund a preschool program that had a very good history in Granite School District. It targeted 3,500 3- and 4-year-olds. And it was a program that over every year is evaluated as the children graduate and as they enter the K through 12 program. Every year that a student scores above a certain score on a standardized test and doesn't need special education services, that means both the state and the local school district saves money. And if they save money, then the investor, in this case it was Goldman Sachs as well as a private foundation, is paid back a return. And so this is going to be evaluated over 12 years. It's been in place for 4 years. It's been very successful so far in terms of the students that they're tracking every year via independent evaluator to make sure that these students are on track and they don't need the special education services. And you have a way of tracking the savings to both the state and the school district, and also the measured impact on these students overall. So this is a relatively new bonding program in the United States. There's been 4 done that Goldman has been involved in. It started in Europe and United Kingdom. And you may hear of it more and more. They're called social impact bonds, as I mentioned, but it's also essentially a risk transfer, right? Because local government bears all the risk of providing the service and not really knowing whether that service works or not. Here in this case, they're providing the service, but they only have to pay if that early education intervention program is effective for students that are being tracked on a regular basis.
I actually asked that question out of order. It didn't belong here. Sorry about that, Ruth. But I'm going to have you and Jason respond to this question. I was talking to the finance director of the province of Ontario, Canada, and Ontario's moved almost to do exclusively P3 financings for their infrastructure projects. And the reason she gave for making that move was that they had a horrible history of bringing public projects in on time and on budget. And so they thought they'd transfer all that risk to the private sector. Is that the reason for doing these projects?
I think that's definitely one of the reasons. Both Kevin and Jason and I have been talking about this idea of risk-adjusted capital. So while there is a financing cost, the cost of borrowing or the cost of, equity, for example, what often is missed is there's this risk-adjusted idea of what your financing cost really is. And so that can include, project cost overruns. It could include, projects being delayed for whatever reason. It could, contracts that, aren't met. And so if you look at, why people do P3, I think the Ontario example is a good one in that there are, definitely projects in certain sectors where if a project is kind of financed and designed by someone with, expertise from the ground up, you can actually provide significant project cost savings, and that's included in the overall project costs coming down and being delivered on time and on budget. There are other government services that are provided that oftentimes, there are expertise that are outside the public sector, for example, that have more business orientation that they can come in and provide cost savings as well. So I think, to answer the question, yes, I think that is one of the reasons P3s can often make sense, but it also just really more broadly depends on, what is it that the local or state government is providing. There are some essential services where it makes sense for there to be a single provider. There are some cases where competition among experts can also result in, a faster delivery or a lower over cost of the project.
Yeah, one of the examples, I guess, that I would use that is a recent example, and it's just beginning, is for a number of years, well, at least 2 or 3 years, the state has courted or tried to get Facebook to establish a significant data center here in the state of Utah. And one of the major barriers that has existed has been the lack of public infrastructure, particularly in areas that would be well suited because of land costs and other reasons. The availability of water resource, sewer, roads, some of that other heavy infrastructure that would be necessary for this type of a company lacked. And despite all the tools that I think the legislature has provided through the Governor's Office of Economic Development and other vehicles that have provided that. I think Facebook is a good example of, again, that shift in risk adjustment where Facebook was willing and is willing to come in and invest $100+ million in public infrastructure, much of which will go way beyond the capacity that they need for what they're developing or what they're building. And so they're entering into a long-term contract with the local government and state government to receive payments back in order to construct that infrastructure in the front part of this. And so I think there are elements of where that really works well. Now, there's probably 10,000 acres of land now that will be developable, at least with the core infrastructure in place now in Eagle Mountain, with good proximity. Again, proximity to Wasatch Front, airports, education, all of that, which is really facilitated by a public-private partnership. And instead of the state or local government taking a significant impact to the tune of 100 million plus, they've shifted that onto Facebook, who is willing to do it. And I think that will be probably a significant strategy going forward as our state continues to try to promote economic development. Infrastructure in our shoulder counties, Box Elder, Juab County, Sevier, some of these have some of the same issues. Lack of infrastructure, not the necessary water, sewer, rail, some of those things. So I think this tool can be good. There are also some disadvantages and some things you'd need to watch out for.
So while you've got the microphone, Jason, some of the disadvantages we've talked about, the financing costs, what can a borrower or an issuer expect to have factored in as far as an interest cost that needs to be overcome in a P3?
Yeah, that's a great question. We had the experience. I know many of this audience is familiar with the Utah Telecommunications Utopia organization. And a number of years ago now, this is probably 7 or 8 years ago, Utopia was approached by a foreign conglomerate who came in and proposed a P3. And the premise of it was that they were going to take a lot of this risk of deploying further fiber to the municipalities in which had not yet received that. And the difficulty was there is they wanted an interest rate factor or a return on investment factor that was nearly 30%. What we noted as we went through the process of evaluating is that most of the risk didn't transfer. The risk still remained with the municipalities. They were still having to backstop the payment streams with sales tax, franchise tax, other revenues. And so, we immediately said, that interest rate factor is not going to work, mainly because we didn't get the benefit of transferring risk to the third party or the P3 provider. So I think that's an element. I think where the repayment stream is more understood and more predictable, we've seen return on investment rates in the 6 to 12%. So if we talk about weighted average cost of capital, there's private equity infusion on the capital stack. You might also have corporate or commercial debt that's placed in there, and then sometimes even public finance or municipal financing is used as well. But typically, even if they know the revenue stream fairly well, their anticipated return is more to that 6 to 12% range. So I think you have to anticipate that if you can borrow at 2, 3, 4, even 5%, there is a benefit of tax-exempt bonding. But as noted, it's really the question of risk. Do the local government want to take a significant risk relative to the capital investment or public infrastructure? And trying to evaluate and quantify that oftentimes can overcome maybe a 2, 3, 4, 5% differential in interest rate.
Great. Kevin, I'm going to give you a tough assignment here, and I want you to explain briefly and simply the difference between a demand risk model, an availability risk model, and a performance risk model.
So let's talk about availability payment concept first. So essentially an availability payment risk profile is that the operating performance risk is being transferred to the concessionaire, the equity investor, if you will. So in this case, it's a greenfield project. Let's say this concessionaire has to actually build the project and then make it available to the public owner. So it's a greenfield availability payment. So So once the project is accepted, put in service, thereafter the concessionaire is required to maintain and operate that asset, make it available, subject to certain performance metrics. And if they fail to achieve those performance metrics, generally related to operations, they get assessed payment deductions from their maximum payment. So if you think about their return profile, they're guaranteed a maximum payment if they perform well, and their downside risk is they'll get less than that full payment. Their return is not subject to the economic performance of the underlying asset, so that's important. It's availability driven only. A demand risk deal, and a good example of a demand risk deal is a toll road, where the concessionaire is agreeing to construct a toll road, and thereafter its return is based on users for the toll road. And their return is purely that. It's subject to economic factors, number of users, other types of variables, competitive factors, alternative routes, whatever the case may be. But they're taking the full economic performance risk for that asset. Their return is predicated on that. The public owner doesn't have any involvement generally in the economic outcome. They may impose certain limits on how fast tolls can be raised, for instance. They may also cap the return. So once the concessionaire has achieved a certain rate of return, thereafter they get the excess revenues. But generally, that economic performance is subject to concessionaire risk. Performance-based is kind of a hybrid, I guess. I haven't seen many of these, but you're kind of tying elements of both of those into the arrangement. It's probably a bit more complex. I'm trying to think of assets that would fit well with that, because at the end of the day, you have to be able to allow the concessionaire to assess the risk they're taking on and be able to price it very effectively. You'll find out in some of these P3s, there are certain risks that the concessionaires generally will never take. They won't take change in law risk, for instance. They won't take, there's force majeure events. Generally, that's a shared risk. So there's certain risks that they can't take, but others that they're very comfortable taking, certainly construction risk and some of the other factors.
Terrific. One of the reasons governments sometimes are interested in this is to see if they can find a way to finance something without putting debt on their books. So David Hitchcock referred to this earlier, that in some cases S&P will count a P3 as debt, and sometimes they won't. Ruth, when is it debt and when is it not?
I think, well, the short answer is it depends, but it may not really matter. I think, from an accounting standpoint and from a rating agency standpoint, there's different factors. But I think the most important thing is if there's a project that you want to finance off balance sheet, there are other financing solutions that your municipal advisor, investment bankers can talk to you about, if that's the goal of being off balance sheet. From a P3 perspective, however, there's the spectrum of the availability payment model that Kevin and I were talking about, where the payment stream can really be even part of your current bond indenture, and your concessionaire partner would actually really like that. That makes the security structure very strong, and then that definitely would be debt on your books essentially. On the other end of the spectrum, it could be it could be structured as a lease. That's an appropriation, for example, and that's kind of like a capital lease, which from a GASB standpoint may not be considered on balance sheet, but from a rating agency standpoint may. So I think the answer really depends. It's very facts and circumstances based. There's no kind of more specific guidelines than that. But whether or not you want something on balance sheet isn't usually the motivation for why a P3 may or may not make sense for a particular project.
Terrific. I was recently at the National GFOA in St. Louis and attended a session on P3 conducted by Ben Watkins, who's the Director of Public Debt in Florida. And he asked the audience the question, P3s, are they snake oil or the silver bullet? So I'll give you one sentence.
Neither.
I think it's a great question. I think there's an element of both, depending on who's presenting the P3 and what their motivations are.
I like Ruth's answer. Neither.
Okay, let's open it up to questions about P3s. Anyone want to ask this panel a question? Treasurer Damschen does.
When we spoke with the individual from the province of Ontario, they talked also about how government in general, I guess was the way I remember it, was horrible at O&M, and it's so much better with P3. So when you're approaching clients and promoting P3 alternatives, how exactly do you come to them and say, I notice you're horrible at O&M. So let's talk about the great benefits of P3 finance. How do you reach that topic? How does that, how significantly does that factor into really the benefits of P3? And seriously, how do you discuss that with clients?
Kevin, you take that.
So you raise a very good point, Treasurer, and that it's not so much even the O&M part, but it's the life cycle costs that never get factored into the overall asset itself. So in all of these concession agreements, one of the important provisions is at the end of the concession term, the concessionaire is required to hand back the asset with a remaining useful life, including funding a hand-back reserve. So there's money already set aside for future capital. So I think if there's one of the benefits of a concession structure, there's a forced discipline to maintain the asset in a state of good repair, rather than what we're seeing now, which is a lot of deferred maintenance that has never been accounted for. And at the end of the 30-year life, since it's never been maintained, it requires almost a complete, rehabilitation. So that's one of the elements that I think is not even that we have to raise that issue. They're well aware of it, acutely aware of it. And it's just very difficult from a budgeting perspective. I'm very sensitive to that from state and local governments. It's hard to set aside money and just let it sit there in anticipation of future expenditures that'll be needed. It's easier to enforce it through a contractual arrangement with a concession agreement.
Other questions? Right here.
Can you disclose who the other investor was in your social bond issue?
Yes, it was a Goldman Sachs, and the other investor was the Pritzker Foundation.
Thank you.
Other questions about P3s? Okay, we'll change subjects here. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2018 eliminated the ability to advance refund on a tax-exempt basis. What alternatives do these folks have to gain some flexibility that has just been taken away? Ruth, we'll start with you.
So yes, I think as folks all know, as part of the Tax Reform Act, a number of things were changed, and notable, I think the general media didn't really pick up on this, but in this room, obviously, everyone was very focused on taking away tax-exempt advance refundings. And I think the way we see it broadly is the impact on not being able to do this. Most people have been focused on, well, you're not able to achieve savings, right? If rates stay low, or over time, as you ride down the yield curve, you're able to advance refund bonds, you're able to have savings, and that being taken away, obviously, has a negative impact. On the other, at the same time, however, is the ability to restructure your debt. So whether it's for savings or not, having that flexibility to either refinance or restructure, having that limitation also is, I think, as important as the inability to achieve savings. So we look at it in two ways. One is on new issues we're doing now in terms of what are ways to increase flexibility. And we have, I think, on the chart up here, some options in terms of what you can do to increase flexibility for any new money issuances. And a lot of issuers have been looking at issuing bonds with shorter par call options. So the standard in the municipal market is 10-year par calls, and there is now an increase in issuers looking to have them with shorter par calls to be able to, refund them within 5 or 7 years. There obviously is a cost associated with that needs to be evaluated against having that additional flexibility. There are some issuers who are looking more closely at variable rate debt, which can be callable anytime. However, that also has, other considerations in terms of interest rate risk to the issuer, as well as potentially liquidity facility costs that are also important to keep in mind. So those are kind of two main ways for new issuances that can be, strategies to increase flexibility. Looking at someone's current debt portfolio, you can always still advance refund with taxable bonds. So if the call date is beyond 90 days from today, you can no longer refund them on a tax-exempt basis, but you can refund on a taxable basis. And there are some cases where that could provide savings and or give you the ability to restructure your bonds. There's also, ways as you get closer to the call date, doing what we call forward delivery refunding. If you're within a year of your call date, there is a way to current refund the bonds, price refunding bonds today. There is a forward premium that locks in your interest rate today until the bonds become currently callable. That's something that a lot of AMT issuers have always been doing, because AMT issuers have not been able to do advanced refundings. And I think that's another tool that's, can be more broadly used. And then there's also what we call a cash optimization strategy. I think, folks on this panel have worked on as well, where you can use your existing cash to defease your debt. And then the cash that you currently, you are currently earmarking for potentially pay-go projects, that is the cash you use to defease your bonds, and then you issue new money bonds to pay for pay-go projects. That's kind of a way you can, do a switch, and we have a chart on that page as well. Obviously, talk with your bond and tax counsel. I'm not a bond lawyer on any of these structures, but there are tools that are available, to issuers to find ways to be able to restructure or refund their debt.
Jason or Kevin, would you add anything?
The only other tool that I'd maybe add, and it goes in, I think in connection with the taxable advance refunding, is we have used what we call Cinderella bonds. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that term, but they're issued initially as a taxable bond, so an advance refunding of the prior issue, and then once you reach the 90 days prior to the call date, or sometime thereafter, then they convert to a tax-exempt rate. So they're initially issued as taxable, then they're predicated on some kind of an index or formula, and then they convert to a tax-exempt. We've used that even before we didn't have tax-exempt municipal advance refundings. And so there are some applications where even if some of your motivation was to get out and under some of the restrictive covenants or change some of the key components of an indenture, and that was your motivation, not saving, so you issued a taxable refunding, you could still secure, potentially through a Cinderella bond, the opportunity to have it tax exempt once you get within that 90 days.
The only other one I would mention, Ruth, I don't know if you mentioned this, I can't see the chart, but is the make whole. So we're also seeing now attempts to create effectively a make whole concept in the tax exempt market. It's very common in the taxable market where essentially you can call the bonds, but you have to essentially pay the investor a make whole. So it's 20-year type or 20 or 30-year bond. It has to essentially pay a premium to the investor. What the municipal market is trying to do is essentially capture that same concept, but only up until the 10-year par call date. So it allows you some ability to call the bond subject to paying this premium, but it's only for the 10-year call date. That way you avoid some of the shorter call penalties, because if you shorten the call on your bonds, the yield kick, as we call it, can be somewhat punitive if you don't call those bonds and they continue to stay outstanding. I will tell you, though, that is in a very embryonic stage at this point. It's very inefficient, but I think over time that you may see that as an element of a way to allow people to call bonds earlier than the first call date.
Excellent. Questions about gaining flexibility now that advance refundings are not available on a tax-exempt basis? No questions? What I asked Ruth to comment on earlier about Granite School District is what we call a social impact bond. That's where an investor will loan money for a program and only get paid back if measures of success are met. These have been done in the UK, started in the UK. The first one done in the US was to try to bring down recidivism at Rikers Island Prison in New York. The investor there did not get paid back because the program that was funded was not successful, but the social scientists still feel like it was worthwhile because they learned definitively what does not work. And so, Jason, why have not more of these been done in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think I came up with three major reasons as I kind of looked at it. I think one is, the element, again, of private transfer of risk. Again, you got private investors, you got those that are interested in investing into a social solution, but they also expect a return on investment. And I think the difficulty with some of these social impact programs or bonds is quantitating or trying to come up with a measurement or a metric to determine whether you're successful. And even with this example, there are a number of other examples where unless there's a significant amount of cost savings, as well as some measurables that you can quantify, it's difficult for investors to feel like they are willing to invest and lend when it's difficult to measure. So I think measuring return on investment objectives is one of the reasons. I think another one is they come with a very significant amount of administrative costs. You not only put the deal together and negotiating the terms and putting those types of elements that you would typically do in a bond financing, but you're also working with a number of stakeholders. In the example Ruth used, you've got the state of Utah, you've got Granite School District, you've got others, as well as the service provider, and there's a lot of stakeholders that you've got to make sure are up to speed, that you're coordinating with, and so administratively, unless there's a lot of potential cost savings, I think it's very difficult to make social impact bonds work. The last one is probably what is obvious, which is there is a disconnect sometime between social objectives and profit objectives. And even though I think Riker was an example of, even though social scientists looked at it and said, hey, that was a win because we figured out what not to do, from an investor's perspective, that really wasn't a great way to learn that lesson. So I think that's a difficulty as well, and maybe as these elements proceed forward that we'll get more clarity on them, but I think those are the three reasons that I thought about.
Kevin and Ruth, do you think this is really being funded by philanthropists who want to do good? Maybe there just aren't enough philanthropists. Would you add anything to Jason's answer?
No, I think Jason's right. I mean, to date, the ones that have been done in the United States have been all 30 million or under, and so there is upfront and ongoing administrative costs, as Jason's mentioned. That takes a lot of time to structure these, and there's a lot of lawyers involved and independent third-party evaluators. I think one reason it's been more prevalent in the United Kingdom is because the government there has actually a scorecard, a rating scorecard, which makes the criteria of whether or not a program is successful much more objective, whereas here in the U.S., it's truly a case-by-case, deal-by-deal basis. So there's really no uniformity. And there's obviously, some social programs that are easier to mention. The preschool program that, Granite did, it's easier to measure in terms of you're tracking this group of students over 12 years, from preschool all the way to 12th grade, and every year they're taking a standardized test. That's a much easier way to measure something than other social programs. In the Riker example, while the investor, which was Goldman, wasn't paid back, it was successful in the sense that there was a risk transfer. There was a risk transfer. The cost of the program was not borne by the city because the program did not meet all its objectives, and there were a lot of lessons learned. There's another program that we're doing similar to the Granite School District in the city of Chicago, also a preschool program, and so each deal we do, we're learning more about what is the right way to measure, what are the risks the investors are willing to take. So I think you'll start to see more of them, but it is, there's a lot of work that goes into these, a lot of time. But when they are successful, there is a growing pool of capital, as John mentioned, that, wants to make what we call kind of double returns, not only a financial return, but also a social return. And that is a growing pool of capital, in the United States and across the world that, is paying more attention to these type of programs.
Kevin, anything to add? No. Any questions about social impact bonds from anyone? Okay, we're not going to get to green bonds or to new market tax credits. I'd like to thank the panel for what they've presented.